I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never.
Genesis, the bigger block is the story of Joseph. It covers from about chapter 37 through 50. We started this block making the observation that Joseph is not really the focus of the genealogical story of Jesus, and yet there's a big, huge block of, what is this, 13 chapters that's dedicated primarily to his story. Anybody remember why we determined that Joseph's story is so important?
The brothers, what they did and why they weren't chosen.
Okay, there is some of that will be outlined through here. Anything else? What role does Joseph play? He does become governor over Egypt, and as governor over Egypt, what does he do? And I know we're getting ahead, but we know this story.
He ends up saving a lot of people's lives because of all the food. It was his idea how to store the food and everything.
Exactly. So he is made aware through a vision that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And he has the foresight to produce and store during that time of plenty so that Egypt has all that it needs through the famine. And he ultimately is going to preserve the lives of his brethren through this. Now, there's a lot of other people get delivered as well, and a few other peripheral things. We talked a little bit about the fact that this is one of the mechanisms that made Egypt so wealthy, and later on at the Exodus, a lot of that wealth would be transferred to the Israelites. When they were leaving Egypt, the Egyptians gave them all kind of gold and clothes and food and all sorts of stuff that they took with them. But primarily, this is about how Israel and his children, particularly Judah, are preserved by God through this famine. The reason why I say particularly Judah is because Judah is, in fact, the one who is the lineage story and how Christ came to us. And so this is God's provision to deliver these people through this event. There's a lot involved in how that deliverance takes place. How important is it to God to provide for his children? It's very important. And we see him do all these things in order to do that. Maybe we ought to understand that God's at work providing for us even still today. And that there's a lot more that's happening than maybe we realize. Because did Joseph's brothers know that they were carrying out the will of God and think that they were doing something good? No. Were the Egyptians trying to carry out the will of God and do something good? No. Did Joseph even understand everything during these years? And the answer is no. And yet, all the while, God is using all of the behaviors and choices of these people and making things happen to preserve. And that's where we get at the end of this story. That's what Joseph comes to realize, and Joseph tells his brethren, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And this goes a long way in explaining what I guess it's the Hebrew writer talks about when he says that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him. God is at work, even though sometimes it doesn't look like it. When Joseph was in prison, when Joseph's life was in peril, when Joseph was being falsely accused and all these other things, that certainly wouldn't have been Joseph sitting down going, man, this is great. I'm glad that she's lying about what I've done, and I have my master that's ready to kill me over it, because that's clearly God taking care of me. That's not how he would have reacted to that. And yet that's exactly what was happening, was God was using those events to get Joseph where he needed him to preserve these lives. And so it's an amazing story when you look at it through that perspective. All right, so the chapter 37, verse 29, Reuben returned to the pit. Behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. And that's just I guess a reaction of despair. I guess sometimes anger. But this was a common way to express grief. When loved ones died, they would tear their robes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and mourn. We're going to see a little bit of that in a moment. So he's reacting, and we know that he is truly upset that his plan is not going to be able to happen. He's expecting Joseph to be there. He's going to help Joseph out. He's going to bring him home, give him to dad, and preserve his life, only he's not there. So he returned to his brothers and said, the boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go? So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, dipped the tunic in the blood. They sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, we found this. Please examine it to see whether it's your son's tunic or not. Now, I'm going to stop and make a couple observations just here. Obviously, everyone knew it was his tunic. This is deceptive on their part to pretend like they're not sure, and they need their father's confirmation that this is, in fact, Joseph's coat. So you get the idea of what they're doing. And what they're going to do, though, is be very passive in the way that they deceive their father. They're not actually going to say to their father, hey, your son's been killed. They're just going to present this to the father and let him draw his own conclusions. Does that make it any better? Is it okay to mislead people as long as you don't actually tell them the lie? No. Yes, ma'am. This parent just is brokenhearted. Anyway, so he examined it. He said, this is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Right there, what should they have done? Oh, no, Dad, that's not what happened. We actually lost him, and we killed a male goat and tore the garment and dipped it in blood, and no, he wasn't really killed. But, of course, they're actually trying to deceive him. So this works toward their goal. Surely he's been torn to pieces, he concludes. So Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. How many is many? We're going to find out at least how he feels in just a few verses about this. But this was not 10 days of mourning. This was not 3 weeks of mourning. He was in mourning for a long time. It was a life-altering thing for him. And to imagine his other sons watching this transformation of their father, the joy in his life being stolen, and them to sit by and not, as they would say in the old days, fess up and say to him, you know, Dad, I feel really bad, but what you think happened is not what happened. We don't really know what happened, Well, some of them did. Reuben didn't really know what happened. But anyway,
You know, it's surprising when the brothers all got together and took the tunic and blood, but when Joseph was, no, when Jacob was mourning, the sons were trying to comfort him. Seems like they really have to give it some thought to comfort him and not let their lips slip.
Yep.
And say
That-
otherwise.
that's a good observation. How duplicitous do you have to be
I
to
mean,
engage in such a plot and then watch someone suffering and even offer comfort to them, all the while you know that what they're mourning is not real? And to be able to do that with a straight face and not be affected by it, that's pretty amazing. They did. They had to be pretty hard-hearted.
The same, you know, except for Reuben. I mean, like,
It-
they all had the same heart.
And then there's the whole thing with Judah that comes in a minute that, you know, it's just, it's a tough thing. So anyway, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this was a highly dysfunctional family is what it would be called today. And again, we have to keep in mind about these brothers, they're not even all full brothers, are they? They share a father, but they come from how many mothers? 4 different women. Well, 3, because Joseph was the only one born to Rachel, and then Benjamin. Yeah. But anyway, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Now, right here we're going to stop. And in chapter 38, we're not going to discuss the story of Joseph at all. We're going to pick up the story of Joseph on the other side of this story about Judah and Tamar. And there's a lot of people that think, hey, this doesn't have anything to do with the story, and this is just kind of an interlude. There's other people that think, hey, this wasn't even part of the original text. This was something that was added later. I don't think any of those positions are correct. I think it does belong. I think it is important to the story. And it is telling us something very important about Judah. And what it's telling us about Judah may end up being different than what we might first think. Anybody read chapter 38 already?
read everything last week. Not this week, last week.
Okay, so it's only been a week. So what's the big general thing that happens in chapter 38? That is correct. He does not. He has 3 sons, and one of his sons marries a woman named Tamar. And the main focus of this story is actually getting us to an interchange between Judah and Tamar. The sons are kind of just the foundation, the backstory behind that event and how it happened. What happened between Judah and Tamar?
Like, all of a sudden, they cozied up.
Well, yes, but they didn't cozy up exactly. There's some deception involved in all that. And he ends up having children with Tamar.
She has a prostitute.
Yep. And so the big thing is, here he is sleeping with his daughter-in-law. Now, that's pretty much not kosher in any society. It's certainly not okay among the people of God. And so this is generally viewed as a bad thing, and it is, but there is something at the end of the story that's going to transform, I think, the purpose and some of what we learn from it and what we learn about the character of Judah in the end and the response of God, I think, is important. So anyway, it came about at that time, this is chapter 38, that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. All right, so he's got a friend that lives somewhere else, and he leaves home. He's not living with his brethren anymore, not living with his father anymore. He goes to another place and visits his friend Hira. Judah saw there, that is where he's now gone to live, a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him By the way, he took her, I take to mean as a wife. And so he married this Canaanite woman, which we already learned back in chapter 28, right? That even though the law hadn't been given yet that prohibited them from marrying with these people, even going as far back as Abraham. Abraham went and got a wife for Isaac from among their people because he didn't want him marrying one of the Canaanite women. And then Isaac encouraged Jacob to do the same thing, right? And then Esau was marrying among those people, and we see the problems that arose from that. In fact, he married more than one of them to spite his parents. So there's already this premise that taking a wife from the Canaanite women was presumably not what God desired. Because God's the one that told Abraham to go back and get a wife for Isaac from among their people and not to have him marry. So the idea originates with God. But this is what he does. He conceived and bore a son, named him She conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his son, and her name was Tamar. So this is his oldest son. He finally got to marrying age. We get an idea of the timeline here too as well, right? So he leaves home, he finds a wife, he gets married, he has 3 children, and the oldest one is now old enough to marry. We're not talking about a few days. He's been there for years. He finds a wife named Tamar, but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Do we know what he did? No. But we know that God ran out of patience with him, right? Because what did he do? Yeah, he smote him because of his perpetual evil. His cup became full. God's patience was exhausted, and God took his life. And Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." All right. So this would eventually be codified in the law, this practice. It's called a levirate, I guess that's how you pronounce that. Levirate marriage is the way it's generally referred to. But in Deuteronomy 25, it was codified in the law that was given through Moses that this was the practice. But clearly it started long before then, that it was the accepted behavior. What this is simply this. The idea of a patriarchal family is that you have a father, and he has his firstborn son, and that is the direct line descendant. So that child, let's say, marries but doesn't have any offspring. That creates problems for the family line, right? There are no offspring produced. So the rule is the next brother in line now takes his former sister-in-law, who's now been widowed, as a wife and bears children. But whose children are they? The first brother, the one that's dead. It's his offspring, so that the lineage continues. This is the premise behind, you'll remember that question when the Pharisees came to Jesus and tried to trick him and created that hypothetical and said, okay, we've got this woman and she marries his brother and then he dies without offspring. So his brother comes along and she's married to him and then he dies. And this goes on until all 7 of them died and they haven't produced offspring. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And that's when he says, you err not knowing the truth. The scriptures are the power of God. They didn't understand the nature of this, and they didn't understand God's ability to raise people from the dead. But this is the premise behind it. So Onan has this duty, and his father comes to him and says, hey, you have this duty. You need to go in and raise up children. Now, he's concerned about this for a couple of reasons. First, it was his obligation to see that it was done. Secondly, this is his lineage that's being interrupted. And so he's concerned. So he tells him, you need to do your duty. But Onan, it says, knew that the offspring would not be his. So it came about that when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. And so he took her as a wife, and he engaged in coitus with her, but he intentionally interrupted that to prevent her becoming pregnant and having offspring, because he didn't want to have to raise children for his brother's name. He didn't mind the benefits of the relationship, but he didn't want the responsibility of the relationship. And so it says, what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Judah said to his daughter-in-law, by the way, I'll mention this real quick. This is actually one of the texts that some of the faiths that believe that birth control is a sin. This is one of the places that they derive that doctrine from. I'm not convinced that it was the birth control aspect of this as much as it was the attitude of, I'm not going to do my responsibility before God. Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house. So this is now the second son that's died. Second husband, no children still. Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I'm afraid that he too might die like his brother. So Tamar went in and lived in her father's house. Okay, so we get a little bit of information here, not a lot of information, but it's important that we notice what's going on here. Okay, the excuse is, my youngest son isn't yet old enough to get married, so just wait until he's old enough and then I'll give him to you. That's the excuse. But we're told that that's not really what he was thinking. So what was he thinking? The end of verse 11, I'm afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So he's already lost 2 sons. And so he apparently starts thinking, maybe it's being married to her that's the problem. I don't want my 3rd son to die too. So I'm going to tell her to just hang on and wait. Yes, ma'am. Can't really answer that question. There's not enough information here for me to be definitive on that. He may have been aware, he may not have been aware. After considerable time. How much is considerable time? I don't know. I'm not even sure how old the third son actually was. I don't know how many years was separating these three kids to even start to get an idea of how many years she might have been being asked to wait. But at any rate, a considerable amount of time has passed. The wife, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, so his wife dies. Judah's wife dies. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah. And his friend Hira, the Adullamite. So he goes to see the Adullamite again. And it was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil. Now, we're getting some insight into this whole process. All this time that she's been waiting, she's been dressed in the garments of mourning. She is not a prospect for someone else. She is not going to marry anyone else. She's been promised to someone, the third son. So she can't do anything. And she's just getting older and older and older, still not having children and not having any promise of stability in her life. No one to provide for her. She's living in Judah's house, but that's it. She's got no offspring. She's got no husband. She's got nothing, and she can't even go marry anyone else. So she takes off her widow's garments, covers herself with a veil, wrapped herself, and sat in the gateway of Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given him as a wife. So enough time has passed. He's grown and he's of marrying age, and Judah's never fulfilled his promise or asked his son to fulfill his obligation like he did Onan. Why hasn't he? Well, again, remember we're told he was afraid. So that's what's going on. And Tamar says what? All right. He's not fulfilling his promise. So if I'm going to be able to ensure my security and my needs in the future, I need to take action. So she finds out where he's going. She goes along the roadside. She conceals who she is. And she waits for him. Now, what does she know? Judah's wife had died. She knew that. So she knew that she could create a tempting scenario for a man who has lost his wife and is no longer able to satisfy those desires with his wife. So she sits on the side of the road. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. I don't know if that was a common thing for harlots to do, but she was concealing who she was. He presumably assumed that she was trying to be anonymous so that she couldn't get in trouble for what she was doing. He turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may come to me?" He said, "Therefore I will send you a kid from the flock." Boy, what a cheap price. But anyway, I'll send you a goat. She says, "Well, will you give me a pledge?" He said, "Listen, Tamar's not dumb." That's what becomes very clear in this whole thing. She knows what she's doing. will you give me a pledge? He said, what pledge shall I give you? She said, well, your seal and your cord and your staff that's in your hand. Okay, the seal is what? Exactly. It's a signet. It's the family emblem. When you get to the story in the New Testament about the prodigal son, when he comes home, he takes off his signet ring and gives it to the boy. That's an indication that he's part of the family, that he's got the father's authority. Okay, so this is a signet. I don't know if it was a ring or if it was a brooch or if it, but it was a metal. They would use that to impress in wax to seal a document so that you knew who it was. We still do this kind of stuff on official documents today. Notaries have seals, and documents are sealed in that way. That's what this was. Your cord, I'm not real sure exactly what that was, other than it must be something that signified his family, who he was, identified him, and the staff that's in your hand. Your stuff, the stuff that you have that identifies you. That's what she wanted. And there's a reason for it. And so he gave them to her, and he went into her, and she conceived by him. She arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. So she goes back home and gets back into her normal attire. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. Well, she wasn't there on the street anymore. And he asked the men of her place, saying, where's the temple prostitute who was by the road in Enam? They said, there's been no temple prostitute here. So he turned to Judah and said, I didn't find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there's been no temple prostitute here. And Judah said, let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this kid, but you did not find her. And so he basically says, okay, let's just forget about it then. Let her keep that stuff, and we can't go around giving too much information about what we're looking for, or people are going to know. So let's just let it go. And that second bell means I have to stop, although it seems a little bit early. I'm going to stop. The bad news is I will not be here next Wednesday. Somebody else will be teaching this class. I don't know if they're teaching the same material or not. So it may be 2 weeks before we get to finish the story. We are right smack dab in the middle of it. So if it's not covered next week by whoever is teaching, please reread it all before we come together. What will the date be? The 15th is the one I'll be gone. So that'll be the 22nd. If I got the date right on that. And we will pick up at 38, verse 24 at that point. This gets really interesting. And there's some important stuff that happens here. And again, we're going toward an end in which, well, you know what? Here's the bad news. I've got the invitation tonight. And actually, the end of this story is going to be part of my invitation. So you're going to get a preview in a few minutes. Appreciate your presence this evening, those of you that could be here. And for those that are watching online, I appreciate your watching. And we'll see y'all next week. No, week after next.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible, the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow in that beautiful land, on the faraway strand. No storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun